Welcome back to our panel discussion, Cyber Authentication and Access Strategies in Government, sponsored by Duo Securities here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. My guests today are Ron Butra, the Chief Technology Officer at the Justice Department. Greg Crabb is Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer at the U.S. Postal Service. Sean Frazier is Advisory Chief Information Security Officer for Federal at Duo Security. Paul Grassi is Partner and Senior Vice President for Cybersecurity at Easy Dynamics Corporation, and Steve Wallace is Technical Director of the Development and Business Center at the Defense Information Systems Agency. And Steve, why don't we start with you with the question of what the actual authenticating factors are that we've been talking about. We've mentioned a lot about the password, of course that needs to go away, I guess, and then the other factor common for most applications is that 6-digit number that comes to your token or your smartphone. But what else? I mean, where are we headed here?
So for years, the DoD moved to two-factor auth using the smart card, and we call it the Common Access Card. We've had the Common Access Card for a number of years, but we realized we need to move beyond that, given the, as I mentioned before, the move to mobility and some of these other form factors that don't necessarily support that. So about 2 years ago, we launched a program called Purebred, which allowed us to put derived credentials, they're derived from the same credentials that are on the Common Access Card, onto mobile devices, and we support all the major mobile platforms now, and we have over 10,000 devices enrolled in the system. But that allows us to use the credential on the mobile devices with other applications. But then beyond that, we've broken the problem into two halves, if you will. The credential that's used to prove as you move around the network, which is those certificates that we discussed. But then also, how does a user prove themselves to the device? So those devices, specifically in the mobile area, are rich with sensors, right? You've got gyroscopes, you've got barometers, you've got GPS, all types of things. How can we better leverage those? And microphones, yes. But how can you better leverage those to prove who has that actual device? We have a few pilots going on right now. One is more desktop oriented, but we're looking at the behavior of the user and how they interact with the keyboard and the mouse, and building a profile of that user, and then constantly comparing that interaction against that known good profile to see who's doing what, or did I share my credential with you, or vice versa? Mm-hmm. So we're doing that, and then we're working with a chipset vendor right now to get some integration down at the chipset level to use those sensors in a trusted manner on the device, not relying on the operating system, but at a deeper level to leverage those sensors to better prove your identity to that device.
Well, a couple of questions then. So with the derived credential, the device can be known to the network.
Correct.
The device has to be known to the user, otherwise it won't be known to the network. Is that kind of the basic logic?
Yes, the credential has to be. It's effectively taking that chip that you see on the smart card or the Common Access Card, and the credentials that are on that chip, and embedding them onto the device. And we're also working with, when I mentioned the work with the chipset vendors, to do better attestation and control of those certificates, basically taking that same technology that's on that card and putting that into the mobile devices to more strongly maintain the control of those.
Just from an industrial standpoint, do you envision the device makers putting those types of chips universally in their devices? That's the only way it would seem to be economical.
Absolutely. So the work that we're doing, the intent is to fold it in. Now, whether the device manufacturers license that capability in that chipset or not, that's up to them. And we're working with manufacturers and all the way down through the operating system vendors. But the idea is to have it more universal and be able to leverage, because we don't want one-offs. We don't want the next SMEPED. We want things that are commercially viable.
I think that's why Fido is interesting to all of us, is that you've got chipset manufacturers, mobile handset manufacturers, the major SaaS software vendors all participating there. So you'd all be surprised at the level of secure technology we're already walking around with. And in that case, there's a couple options. You can take that certificate off the Common Access Card, embed it on the phone, or you can leverage that protocol, the Fido protocol, which will create the key on the phone and link back to that cert. So there's a lot of ways to skin this cat and have that same level of security and use what we are already carrying around.
Yeah, and Steve referenced behavioral dynamics that might affect whether something is authenticated, like such as how they interact with the keyboard. Ron, I'm wondering if maybe another behavior such as the person's location could be used. Hey, wait, we didn't know they were in Russia, or maybe zones could be whitelisted where people can operate from, and that would be almost not the authenticating factor, but maybe a gatekeeper.
So I think we're seeing this larger trend of understanding or doing analytics off of the behaviors of how people are logging in or how they're interacting with their systems. Unusual behaviors ought to be triggered, and we've seen this, and I know there's a number of key services out there and third-party providers that are helping with those analytics. Where that becomes a little more challenging at a federal department level is, again, this proliferation of different devices, and how do we bring all those logs so that are we seeing different behaviors across components as opposed to just for one system. And I think that's part of what you're seeing as a broader trend across the federal government is how do we make sure that the user behaviors and the security for our data and systems and users are at a larger scale.
Yeah, so that gets you out of strict logic into more of what one time they called fuzzy logic, or you need algorithms to understand the correlation between the hard physical pieces and the behavioral characteristics.
Absolutely. And it drives more towards the need for us to have strong analytics on our cybersecurity systems. We're not just collecting logs, but we have to have that strong analytic piece.
And Sean, can you extend that thought to include the many, many millions of end devices, endpoints, that are not associated with a person, that maybe just sit there, but nevertheless have an IP address?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, obviously, this can apply equally to them. We focus more certainly on the user-based access, and as Steve pointed out and Paul elegantly pointed out, we're carrying around in our pocket right now these devices that can do a lot of these great things already. I mean, anyone who uses Face ID and Apple Pay realizes that at scale, some of these technologies work really, really well. So I think having that extra factor is really important. Steve mentioned Purebred, which is something the DoD is working on, which is fantastic, and that's kind of the next evolution of CAC. And then beyond that, you need probably another factor, because CAC was two-factor. Sometimes certificate-based auth, depending on the platform, is not exactly two-factor. So you need something a little stronger that layers on top of that.
What might some of those be, those factors?
It depends. So there's no one-size-fits-all. There are all kinds of different use cases. Hardware tokens are useful at a higher authentication level or authorization level. But something as easily as push technology, which is kind of baked into the platform, or GCM on the Google side, baked into the platform already, can be used for a lot of those use cases.
But in these use cases, I guess the implication is that they invoke themselves. It's not some step that the user has to do.
No, again, easy, remember? Right. A lot of security, really easy. So you want to make it really easy for the user so they know exactly what they're doing. And again, maybe that second factor is even a Face ID. Hold your device up to your face and you're in.
And they don't try to work around it.
Yeah, exactly.
Craig, thoughts?
For the Postal Service, we're at the intersection of leveraging all of these technologies and process management activities in order to be able to provide for the carriers that are on the street to be able to deliver your packages. And for us, how do we get the mobile delivery devices that our carriers use and our vehicles to be able to interoperate together, as well as examining the behaviors that our carriers make with these technologies to make sure that it's the right person doing the right thing with the right vehicle so that we can deliver your package at the right time and the right location. So all of those factors of geolocation, as well as all of the technical components from a certificate management perspective across these devices, all play a very critical role in being able to predict, authenticate, and assure that we have solid transactions across the country every day.
Now, in the case of federal agencies, maybe more so than private sector organizations, you have people on site working, doing work on your behalf that are contractors. Some agencies, there's more contractor employees than federal employees. And they have maybe slightly different access rights, slightly different privileges that their authentication can invoke for them. How do you fine-tune these technologies for the different types of people that might be coming in, working in your environment and accessing your systems? Someone want to make a stab at that?
I can, but I'm not a Fed.
Well, you're a former Fed.
Okay.
Yeah, you're close enough.
So, I think the first and foremost is we're conflating authentication with authorization, and too often we give too much access just because somebody authenticated, and we've got some pretty serious breaches in government to prove that. So, I tend to live by the authentication should get you nothing, and then we look at attributes. You can look at context, environmental attributes for authorization. And the problem with that authorization is you're kind of stuck with the platform that you buy, and everyone kind of does it differently. The standards in the authorization space are there, but they're still not completely well integrated with SaaS, new applications, legacy applications. So that's going to remain to be a challenge. However, and I hate to say this word, but we've also got convergence of authentication and authorization, especially on the behavioral side, which is, I can start monitoring and see what the typical behavior is of a given role in an organization, not a person. And then if I see a blip out of that, I know that somebody in that role, and I know who the person is now misbehaving, and I should probably follow up. So that's where this kind of continued authentication behavioral could play a role in authorization and preventing breach.
I think, Steve, go ahead.
Well, I think to pile on, that's one of our next steps naturally is to start looking at, I talked about their physical behavior, but then also I've got a Windows admin that's suddenly launching a lot of SSH sessions and doing a lot of SSHing around the network. I need to be watching the behavior of what they typically do as opposed to what they are actually doing. And then they get deeper into your question about the attributes and that kind of thing. We've always, at small scale, things like ABAC and RBAC have worked quite well. The challenge becomes at scale or when you try to get finer grain, because a lot of the application owners, they don't trust the attributes. You can prove to them that you have the most up-to-date attribute store that's out there, but a lot of them are not, they're not amenable to hanging their hat on the fact that your stuff is up to date. They would prefer still to manage an ACL. I'm not saying that's the best method, but in practice, a lot of the application owners are often shy when it comes to things like ABAC and trusting attributes.
That's sort of a risk management issue in some ways.
Yes.
So I love that Paul said authentication should get you nothing, because that's absolutely correct, right? I mean, that's the whole concept around the zero trust model, which is just because you get in the front door doesn't mean you're getting access to anything until I prove who you are and you deserve that access. The other challenge to that is to continually monitor, so constantly look at that user as they're evolving, as Steve points out, either behaviorally or other ways, to say, are they changing over time? If they're changing, I want to maybe prompt them for other factors. I want to block access. And the balance and the challenge is doing that without being intrusive to the user.
Yeah, Ron, you had mentioned this kind of behavioral analytics also.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we had talked about is this federated approach towards authentication. And one of the things as you're having this discussion is that when people are taking a look at the analytics or user behaviors or putting on additional factors to look for or enhance their cybersecurity, is that technology and interoperability to federate that type of trust across systems isn't there. So we're essentially building out these frameworks. We have to do it for our own organization. And then as we federate authentication, we also have to think about how we're going to allow for this greater trust model.
And can all of this good authentication and then authorization as a separate piece, can all of this be separated from legacy application development? In other words, can this type of architecture we've been describing for authentication and now a little bit on authorization, can it apply regardless of the application, which might be 30 years old or it might be developed by U.S. Digital Service last week?
So Paul made a really good comment early on about leveraging a lot of those technologies like Fido up to the perimeter and then inside translating back, right? And I think that's what you were meaning by that, right? So we've done that in a number of instances where we have applications that don't support PKI, but I have a higher level of trust within my own data center and what's going on there. So I use strong authentication to get them to the door, and then I might lessen it as we get in.
Well, I wish we had another hour, but we don't, and we're going to leave it with that. Thank you very much to today's guests. Ron Butra, the Chief Technology Officer at the Justice Department. Department. Greg Crabb is Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer at the U.S. Postal Service. Sean Frazier is Advisory Chief Information Security Officer for Federal at Duo Security. Paul Grassi is Partner and Senior Vice President for Cybersecurity at Easy Dynamics Corporation. And Steve Wallace is Technical Director of the Development and Business Center at the Defense Information Systems Agency. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. You've been listening to Federal News Radio 1500 AM. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsradio.com. Use the search term DUO.
On behalf of Duo Security, thank you for joining us. The archive session will be available shortly. If you qualified for continuing education credit, you will also receive an email with your training certificate. This concludes our discussion. Thank you.